Good morning. It's wonderful to be back with you all here at our beloved Agudas Achim. I was gone for 2 weeks, and Mazel Tov, it looks like the building is still standing, and you all didn't build a golden calf while I was away. So I think we can all consider this a win. A lot of people have been asking me since I got back from my trip. They say, how was it? How was it? And I've been giving a typical one-word response to this question, which in no way conveys the experience I had. I keep saying, it was awesome, which it was. But that word, awesome, does not accurately represent the litany of emotions, interactions, and expeditions that I undertook while I was exploring 3 different countries in Asia. Now, half the reason I tell my wife, half the reason I go on vacation is to get fodder for later sermon ideas. And trust me, you'll be hearing a lot more about my experience overseas, probably during the high holidays. But I wanted to give you a little anecdote about my time in Thailand because I feel like it is certainly relevant to what the Torah is talking about this Shabbat and what we read just several moments earlier here in Shul. Allow me to begin by saying something that is pretty obvious, but that I had not really thought about beforehand so much. There is a lot of avodah zarah, or what Jewish tradition would call idolatry, happening in Thailand. Now, sometimes in the Jewish lexicon, we throw around words with probably antiquated meanings, and they don't really have the same authenticity or authority that they once had. For example, when Yoshiyahu HaMelech, when King Josiah was tasked with destroying avodah zarah, he literally went to pagan temples and shrines around Eretz Yisrael, and he tore down altars and statues to fake idolatrous gods like Baal. Friends, that is what I like to call classic avodah zarah. These are things that are obvious and identifiable as biblical idolatry, i.e. statues to Ishtar, statues to Baal. Now, one can make the argument, and people have, that statues of modern saints or statues of the Christian Messiah is idolatrous, but most of our sages and our rabbis concede that while those statues are not something you should have in your home, it's not classically idolatrous, like a statue to an ancient Mesopotamian deity. They have a little bit of different flavor of idolatry. Well, let me tell you, when you get to Thailand, there are all kinds of statues of all sorts of people and all sorts of critters. And I thought, going into it, that I knew about most of these statues, who they are, what they represent, because after all, when you're drawn to organized religion like I am, oftentimes you do your research into all of the world's major religions, and so I felt like I was somewhat familiar with Buddhism, which is primarily the religion of most Asian countries. So we'd be driving around in our cab, and we'd see all sorts of Buddha statues. There were fat Buddhas, there were skinny Buddhas, there were Buddhas with long ears, Buddhas with short ears. We saw a statue of a golden Buddha that was literally taller than the Statue of Liberty. And we saw statues of Buddhas that were smaller than the size of a Tic Tac. Friends, there were a lot of Buddha statues. But there weren't just Buddha statues. There were many others that probably had a Hindu influence as well. There were statues of men, there were statues of women, of men with multiple heads, there were statues of women with the head of a bird, there were elephant statues, statues of their elephant deity, there were lion statues, lion dog statues, and demon dog statues, so many statues. And I want to give myself credit, allow me to give myself a public pat on the back here. Most of these statues or traditions I had read about before, either in college or other research, and I was somewhat familiar with most of them, all except for one. And this guy threw me a bit. There was a statue of a seven-headed snake, and it caught my attention because, ironically, it looked a lot like a menorah. And this one statue I was not familiar with, and I couldn't place it, and it made me mad that I didn't know what it was. So I did what you should not do, something my wife was not happy that I did. I asked our cab driver. I said, "Hey, what's the deal with the snake statue guy?" And when I asked his question, his face brightened up. My wife's face did not brighten up. She was elbowing me, "Be quiet." But he told me that is the Mukalinda. And I said, "Great, what is that?" And the driver then told me, in somewhat broken English, but enough for me to understand, that according to legend, after the Buddha began meditating under the Bodhi tree, and after he achieved enlightenment, the heavens darkened for 7 days, and an enormous rain descended, and all the evil animals and demons sought to attack the Buddha while he was vulnerable in his meditative position. However, the mighty king of serpents, Mukalinda, came forth from beneath the earth and protected the Buddha. And when the great storm had cleared, the serpent king assumed his human form, bowed and rejoined to his palace. Okay. Most people would hear that story and just move on with their lives. Great, Mazel Tov, Serpent King. But for me as a rabbi, I had to make the connection with Jewish tradition and to what the Torah says about symbols and ideas like these. And so when I heard the cab driver say this, I knew I had a sermon for this week. Because believe it or not, in our Parshiot Hukat Balak, this also contains the story of a snake statue. Now, the story of what we call the bronze serpent actually appears in Parshat Hukat, in the book of Numbers, chapter 21. Mike Winokur read it, like I mentioned just a couple moments ago. And if you'll remember from the story, the Israelites, go figure, has once again begun to complain in the wilderness. They're hungry, they're tired, they're frustrated, and they began speaking against God and against Moses. And as a consequence, the Torah tells us that venomous snakes are let loose into the camp, and many Israelites are bitten. Boy, howdy. And after multiple people get chomped, the people, go figure, begin to repent. They cry out to Moses, "Please stop all of this snaky biting." And God then gives Moses what has to be one of the strangest commandments, in my opinion, in the entire Torah. God says, quote, "Make yourself a fiery serpent statue and place it upon a pole, and anyone who was bitten by the snakes shall look at it and live." By the way, as a side note, if you have ever noticed the medical symbol with the staff and the snake coiled around it, this is the story where that image comes from. That image is supposed to replicate healing when people look at it, so the medical field has adopted it. Wonderful. Now, if you're paying attention, this snake statue idea should make you somewhat uncomfortable because, wait a minute, isn't the Torah against images and the making of graven statues? In fact, didn't we just spend that entire book talking about how making a golden calf was not a good idea? Now God says, go make a bronze serpent? Wait, what changed? The rabbis of our tradition, they ask this very same question in the Mishnah. They ask, did this serpent kill, and did the serpent give life? The answer is, of course not. The sages suggest that the bronze serpent had no magical powers. Rather, the rabbis say when the Israelites looked upward, they were actually looking past the servants, and they directed their prayers toward heaven, and that is why they were healed. The rabbis, this snake statue was never the source of healing. God was. The bronze serpent for the sages was just a symbol, nothing more. It served a purpose, and it reminded the people where their attention really belonged. But here's the fascinating part. Hundreds of years later, during the reign of Hizkiyahu HaMelech, King Hezekiah, the Tanakh tells us that this very same bronze serpent statue is destroyed by the king. Why? Because the people had turned it into avodah zarah, and they had begun burning incense in front of it and worshiping it. Somewhere along the way, the people forgot what it represented. They stopped seeing a reminder and started seeing an object with power. Now Hezekiah smashes it, and he gives it an almost sarcastic name. He calls it the Nehushtan. And if you translate that, it's an interesting translation. It basically translates to, this is just a piece of bronze. Because in reality, friends, that's all it ever was. The power was never in the metal. The power was never in the craftsmanship. The power was never in the object itself. The power was only in the God to whom it pointed to. And friends, this makes me think back to Thailand, because the irony is almost impossible to ignore. If you read about the historical Buddha, Siddhartha, one of his central teachings he taught about was detachment. He preached the giving up of wealth, of status, and material possessions, and yet today, people have built enormous golden statues to him. Some of these statues are covered in gold leaf, and like I mentioned, some of these statues tower hundreds of feet into the sky. Now, obviously, I am not an authority on Buddhism. I don't want to caricature another faith tradition, but it's striking to me that a teacher remembered urging for detachment from material wealth is so often now represented in gold. But that's the point. We as human beings do this all the time. We take a person, an idea, a symbol, and we slowly transfer our attention to the thing itself. And that is precisely why Judaism is so uncompromising about avodah zarah, about idolatry. You see, idolatry isn't merely believing in the wrong or incorrect God. Our tradition teaches it's giving ultimate significance to something that doesn't deserve it. It's taking something that has no inherent power and investing it with our energy, our trust, our hope, and our devotion. The bronze serpent wasn't the problem, and the golden calf wasn't really about the gold. The problem begins whenever our attention settles on some symbol instead of the source, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our God. And if we're honest, modern idolatry rarely looks like a bronze snake. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's our politics, our careers, sometimes it's our smartphones, sometimes it's our own opinions. Our sages teach that anything can become an idol if it receives the devotion that only belongs to God. In conclusion, the Torah reminds us that symbols can be beautiful, traditions can be meaningful, and objects can inspire us, but these are never supposed to be the destination. They're only signs pointing us towards something infinitely greater. Because bronze is just bronze, and gold is just gold. Stone is just stone. And the only one worthy of our ultimate attention, our trust, and our worship is Ribbono Shel Olam, God of our ancestors. So remember the next time that you are tempted into putting your energy into something else, you only believe in one God, and He is more than enough to sink your fangs into. Shabbat Shalom.